I wanted to start off with a tiny historical note. As luck would have it, I got a letter this morning from this retired person. He's writing from the yacht club in Miami, where he's retired. I sometimes get things sort of Sellarsiana that people send me. And here he said, so he had sent a copy of the book he'd written on the Socratic philosophers in his retirement. He's a retired lawyer, but passed this on with a note. I took a summer course from Professor Wilfrid Sellars at the University of Minnesota, so this has to be in the 50s. He was a very imposing figure in the classroom. He was always dressed in a three-piece suit. He looked more like a British banker than a summer school lecturer. He did a lot of walking in front of the class. It was not a very smooth walk, but a little bit stilted. I remember him as being a very handsome man. His hair was wavy with a bit of a curl to it. He wrote on the blackboard extensively. His lectures were very well organized. I don't remember that he encouraged class discussion. In fact, he seemed a bit unapproachable. I don't remember ever asking him a question, but I was almost hypnotized by his lectures. I got an A from him. Some years later, I was teaching political science at a college. An elderly gentleman with the last name Sellars gave a lecture to the faculty about modern philosophy. I remember him saying that where previous philosophers had said that humans were subjected to bombardments of knowledge, now, according to modern philosophers, he said that the humans reach out to obtain knowledge rather than being the victims of bombardments of knowledge from the outside. After the lecture, I told him that I took a course in philosophy from a Sellars at the University of Minnesota. He said, "Oh, that's my son." Small world. Anyway, I don't know what historical use this is, but I will pass it on to the archives so that people won't lose this little anecdote. Okay, I didn't at the end last time get to talk about the pure pragmatics and epistemology essay. And for most of it, that's okay. I think in the treatment of stories and world stories, some things are clearer in PPE than they are in the realism, the new way of words. If you care about that particular sort of phase of his development, you should read them together and probably should look at the concepts as involving laws and inconceivable without them, essay 2. But I think PPE is particularly remarkable for the way he sets out what he's doing and why he's doing it in larger philosophical space. So I'm just going to remind you of some of these passages. They were on the handout from last time. He starts off talking about analytic philosophy. And this is in the year before he publishes his, as it turns out, classic, sort of definitive collection of essays in analysis that really helped define a canon for analytic philosophy. He included realism and the new way of words in that, which was an astonishingly bad choice. But by then, he had written Language, Rules, and Behavior. If he had only chosen that instead of this other piece, then I think his position in early analytic philosophy, beginning of the second half of the 20th century, would be somewhat different. But he's definitely seeing himself joining a rising movement and trying to help define that. So producing that book was one way of doing that, as well as being a way to sort of get on in his career, because he was not publishing that much stuff. Once the dam was broken around 1950, in the next 15 years, he wrote and published 50 papers in that first 15 years. So once he started writing, he really started writing. but he was in 1950. He was 38 and had not, just had a handful of things. Anyway, he starts off. The attempt to draw a clear distinction between philosophy and the empirical sciences can almost be taken as the defining trait of the analytic movement in contemporary philosophical thought. Now, I don't know if you sort of look back from where we are now, whether you would say that was a defining trait. And it isn't clear how important that was to, say, Russell and Moore. It was to Carnap, and he's the index figure here. But Sellars goes on. Characteristic, then, of analytic philosophy has been the rejection of what it terms psychologism, and what he, in other places, he thinks of psychologism as an instance of descriptivism, which ends up being his favorite term for that. Later on in here, he uses descriptivism. He also uses factualism as the broader notion of which psychologism is a key. The analytic movement in philosophy has gradually moved towards the conclusion that the defining characteristic of philosophical concepts is that they're formal concepts. What's the contrast class? Formal concepts relating to the formation and transformation rules of symbol structures called languages. Philosophy, in other words, tends to be conceived as the formal theory of languages. Now, here he's already persuasively redescribing things. I mean, Carnap does say this is a matter of form, where the empirical sciences are in charge of content. They're working in an object language, we're working in a meta language. So he is making a distinction between the meta-linguistic work of philosophy and the ground level work of empirical sciences, paradigmatically the natural sciences. But he's also making that in terms of a distinction between form and content. But for Sellars, the important thing is that what you formulate in the meta language is rules. And for Sellars, the distinction that matters is not between form and content. He uses form to mean statement of a rule, something normative. So he goes on to say, now section 2, the analytic philosopher establishes his right to attack psychologism, and he's using these martial metaphors, with respect to a given concept, if he's able to show that it's capable of treatment as a concept, the nature and function of which is constituted by its role in the rules definitive of a broader or narrower set of calculi. So it's concerned with rules that he's contrasting with psychologism. Goes on in this section. These rules constitute a logic of implication and deducibility. In this stage of the battle, we had the attack before, now we have the battle against psychologism, an apparently clear-cut distinction arose between symbol behavior and formal system, a distinction sometimes summed up as that between inference as fact and deducibility as norm. So he's picking the bits out of Carnap that emphasize the rules. As a result, so it's a little bit of other chit-chat about how the analytic philosophers sometimes backslide from this insight. Factualism and psychologism are flourishing in analytic philosophy, and by no means on the fringes only. So the battle needs to continue. The invasion stems in part from a carryover from the psychologism that characterized much of the controversy over sense perception in the teens and the 20s. This is flatly false. This psychologism of thinking about sense perception in the teens and the 20s, that's those trinominal philosophers, most prominently his father, no one else in analytic philosophy cares about them at all. Carnap doesn't, Feigl doesn't, of the people he's thinking about. No one cares about that. That is not why psychologism is happening in analytic philosophy, why you need to constantly be emphasizing that form is a matter of norms in the form of rules. That matters for him, and he's seeing at this point in his career that that whole tradition was psychologistic, that it was innocent of the normative turn that Kant had made. So there's a little backhand gesture, well, this is what Dad never got, was he didn't make the normative turn. But he says, but also, and indeed this is the decisive factor, and it is the decisive factor, to the incompleteness of semantics, at least as presently constituted, as a foundation from which to launch a decisive attack against these enemies of philosophy, not just enemies of analytic philosophy, but of philosophy, if you don't make the distinction between what's going on in the natural sciences and philosophy, you're an enemy of philosophy. And this is a point on which he's in agreement with Wittgenstein early and Wittgenstein late. The only sentence from the Tractatus that appears verbatim in the Philosophical Investigations is the claim philosophy is not one of the natural sciences. That Wittgenstein didn't give up with the Kehre between the early and the late work, and Sellars is right with him on that. In section 4, I'm now in a position to define the topic of this paper. If an analytic philosopher wishes to attack psychologism in epistemology, which fundamental concepts should he claim to be mistakenly treated as psychological or in general factual concepts, as opposed to formal, that is, normative concepts having to do with rules, with how things ought to be done? In other words, from the standpoint of analytic philosophy, which concepts of those traditionally classified as epistemological properly belong to philosophy? Now, this is an attitude that Sellars has learned from Kant, thinking of Kant's criticizing the one he called the celebrated Mr. Locke for having produced a mere physiology of the understanding in place of a proper epistemology. Instead of worrying about just issues of justification and what's a reason for what, Locke concentrated on mechanisms. What are the causal chains, the causal antecedents of our beliefs? That's what Kant was invoking under the heading of the mere physiology of the understanding. And he says, we've interpreted this to mean, that is, which of the concepts dealt with in traditional epistemology are genuinely philosophical concepts. We've interpreted this to mean concepts of which the function and essence is to serve in rules definitive of a type of object calculus. So it's the concepts that codify rules for doing something. And then in section 7, he says, these include verification, confirmation, meaningfulness, justification, and the use of the term pragmatics in connection with these is well established, he says. It isn't well established. There's a couple of remarks in Carnap where he says you can call these things pragmatics, but Sellars is, persuasively redefining analytic philosophy, formal and here pragmatics. In any case, it's only if there is, shall we as philosophers extend the term semantics or narrow the term pragmatics? He says, in any case, it's only if there is a pragmatics that's not an empirical science of sign behavior, a pragmatics which is a branch of the formal theory of languages, the normative, the one that is concerned with rules, that the term can be rescued for a branch of philosophy. And he says, and it's only if there is such a new dimension of calculus structure, calculi is what Carnap had, whether its analysis be called pure pragmatics or pure semantics, whichever we call it, it's only if there is a branch that studies the rules of these things that the analytic philosopher can hope to give a non-psychologistic account of the key concepts of traditional epistemology. And in section 8 then, syntactical predicates have as their domain expressions in a calculus which is a norm for symbol behavior. He says the terms model and norm here are used to suggest a problem rather than indicate a solution. In general, the properties to which the calculus owes its status as a norm for symbol behavior are due to the fact that it's constituted by formation and transformation rules. Its status as a norm is constituted by the rules, and he goes on to say, we should recognize that it would be nonsense to say that human symbol behavior is constituted by syntactical formation and transformation rules. The calculi are, the norms are, but the matter of factual behavior is not constituted by the rules. It may stand in some interesting relation to those rules, but he's saying it would be nonsense to think of the matter of factual behavior as constituted by the rules, whereas the proper subject of philosophy is constituted by the rules. So in 9, drawing a distinction between language as behavior and language as behavior to the extent that it conforms and as conforming to the criteria of language as norms. Or, in the terminology we shall adopt, this is the distinction between language behavior qua behavioral fact and language behavior qua tokens of a language as type, where he said type is the way he's going to talk about norms as the form, the things that are subject to rules. In 10, to recapitulate, the solution to our dilemma appears to require a threefold distinction between 1, language as norm or type, 2, language as behavioral fact, and 3, items in the second class, actual languagings, which token and as tokening items in the first class. As here he's saying this is the first sort of stirrings of his idea that performances, events, what elsewhere he calls languagings, applications of expression, lead 2 lives. They're amphibious. On the one hand, they are tokenings of types. That is, they are subject to assessment as correct or incorrect according to rules. On the other hand, they participate in the causal order. They are events in the natural world. And here, and in Realism in the New Way of Words, his account of what it is to use a language in a world and therefore about the world turns on this amphibiousness, on the fact that the very same thing can be in the causal order and subject to assessment according to norms. And we're going to see this as a theme with him throughout. Okay, and then just the last passages that I'll mention here. The clarification of the status of formal systems is the culminating task of a philosophy of language. Remember, this is a phrase that he uses that hardly anyone else uses at this point. It's a culminating task of a philosophy of language and must be treated as such. If the question is put too soon, the answer will inevitably be empirical in a bad sense. In a word, scientism. Scientism as trying to have science do the job that philosophy is supposed to do. And here he wants to insist that, this is in section 11, an empiricist answer to a philosophical question need not be an empirical answer. And this is, again, something he sees in Carnap, that Carnap is an empiricist, but thinks of philosophy as working with these metalinguistic concepts and the metalinguistic concepts in terms of which you formulate different kinds of rules. That's not an empirical investigation. So Sellars here is identifying opposing psychologism, showing what's wrong with psychologism as the defining trait of analytic philosophy, and indeed of philosophy tout court. He thinks this is the insight of analytic philosophy, is to see a special way of doing that by thinking about the rules for using expressions, by going metalinguistic. That's going to give special resources for the fight against psychologism, which he sees as the task of philosophy. This is a Kantian view that he has. In his view, Kant would be rolling in his grave to be read in the way various Kant readers, maybe Pat Kitcher is a paradigm, reading him as a cognitive psychologist avant la lettre, seeing him as giving us mechanisms, psychological mechanisms. It's pretty clear that one of the things that drives Kant to write the B edition as opposed to the A edition is that he finds the A edition too psychologistic. It's giving aid and comfort to a psychologistic misunderstanding of what he's doing. And more than anything else, that's what he's trying to, that's the misunderstanding he's trying to avoid in the B edition. Okay, on this psychologism, I wanted to cite Stanley Cavell's 3-sentence history of philosophy. He says, Kant de-psychologized epistemology. So Cavell appreciates this normative term. Frege de-psychologized logic. Again, Frege's notes that logic is a normative discipline. It's not how people do think, but how they ought to think. And Wittgenstein de-psychologized psychology. And I want to say, and Sellars too. That's what he's talking about here, is de-psychologizing psychology as part of this normative turn. Now, bow to no one in my admiration for Cavell, able to put this point so pithily. I'll mention my favorite version or development of another bon mot that Cavell originated is talking about, again, the relation between philosophers. So in 1889, Nietzsche famously dissolved into the insanity that he would exhibit for the rest of his life. He was basically a non-compos mentis and not coherent. After this episode in 1889, when he broke down weeping, seeing a cartman beating his horse who could no longer get up, and the cartman is just beating him. Nietzsche breaks down weeping and was never coherent again after this episode in 1889. And Cavell said that he liked to think that Nietzsche's spirit split into 4 sparks at that point. Cavell originally only had 3. 3, I'm adding 1 here, and entered the souls of 4 figures who were born in that year of 1889. Heidegger, Wittgenstein, Hitler, and Charlie Chaplin. So there's an implicit reading of Nietzsche in thinking of these as the aspects of his spirit that sort of purified and separated from one another. This is what you get. Cavell didn't include Heidegger in this, but I don't understand why. Anyway, you can think of this genre of remark. Okay, well, this was really all I wanted from the PPE essay, is how remarkable it is to see Sellars as putting the fight against psychologism at the center of his understanding of what philosophy is about. So on this account, we really didn't understand it until Kant. And people since then who don't see Kant's revolutionary significance in terms of this normative revolution still don't really understand what philosophy is, according to this view. And Sellars is telling us here why the new way of words in Carnap's, in the form of Carnap's works, hit him so hard, because he could see in it new tools for making this sharp distinction between philosophy and any empirical science, this metalinguistic term. And this remains at the center of Sellars' work for the rest of his life. This Kantian normative turn, and seeing in Carnap a new strategy for elaborating this Kantian insight, namely going metalinguistic and looking at rules for the use of symbols. Okay. Anybody wants to say or ask about that? Okay. Well, let me talk about language rules and behavior. This is really an astonishing piece. Written in 1949. I think it has in it the essence of Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, which would not be published or really composed for 3 years. But you'll see that the same sorts of themes here, and I think if you're hazy about just how to read Wittgenstein in the investigations, language rules and behavior, and then some reflections on language games, which is still only 1951, still 2 years before Wittgenstein would come out. I think you can take that as having the core of Wittgenstein's message, and then you can compare and contrast around the edges. Sellars said, very often understanding takes the form of a model and a commentary on it. A commentary saying, well, in which respects is the phenomenon like the model, and in which respects isn't it? And I think these 2 essays one can take as the model for reading Wittgenstein. And then there will have to be a commentary that goes with it as well. I think McDowell disagrees with that, but sort of not with every piece, but there's sort of more commentary and less model there. So I read Wittgenstein this way, and John's response to that is his pithily titled "How Not to Read Wittgenstein" on Brandon's reading of that. But I'm going to talk about some of those disagreements as we go on here. Now, because I read Sellars as broadly a pragmatist, even though he usually, when asked, said that he was not a pragmatist. But we'll see every once in a while he makes pragmatist noises. One thing that I find particularly interesting about this essay, it was written in a Festschrift for John Dewey, and so Sellars addresses pragmatism in this. Pragmatism is good insofar as it's a form of anti-psychologism. Maybe not surprising given what we were just looking at. He never reprinted this essay, and it was in a really obscure place. I mean, if you publish something as a chapter in a book, it is not nearly as accessible as things that come out in journals. And so very often one thinks, okay, that then when we do a collection of Sellars' things, we'll reprint it. But in Science, Perception, and Reality, the collection that Sellars did in '63, he included some reflections on language games. It's the very last essay in the book, even though it was written before everything else in the book. But he didn't include language rules and behavior, and not in his later collections either. When Reck and Truckee formed the idea of gathering up his early papers, they included it in the collection, Pure Pragmatism and Possible Worlds, but that didn't come out until the 80s. So basically, no one ever read this essay, or at least only people who were willing to seek it out because they already cared about Sellars. And yet, it is an astonishing piece for 1949 for articulating the importance of rules and beginning to raise issues about rules that most of analytic philosophy would not concern itself with until the 80s already. He says in the initial footnote to this essay that it grew out of his discussions with Feigl. Remember, we recited his remark that for many years he and Feigl were separated parts of one single entity. Talking with Feigl about pragmatism, about Dewey, and as I indicated a minute ago, I wonder about the alternate intellectual world in which Sellars put this essay into his book, Essays in Analysis, in Philosophical Analysis, which was very widely read, instead of the only semi-coherent realism in the new way of words. Now, one historical note on this essay that I seem not to have noticed in my previous readings of it is that he twice mentions the phrase, the failure of nerve, in it, and says, look, I'm with you, pragmatists, we've got to recover from the failure of nerve. Without further explanation about this, as though this is something everybody could be expected to know about. And as I say, I read this essay many times and never stopped to wonder about this. But it turns out, well, if you were in the market as the audience for a book about John Dewey, then probably this was a phrase that everybody knew. there now is a 2-volume collection. Well, I mean, there was, by the late 40s, a 2-volume collection called The Failure of Nerve, edited by Sidney Hook, who was something like Dewey's principal student, most famous Deweyan. And I think the phrase, the failure of nerve, is Sidney Hook from an earlier article, late 30s or early 40s. And what he was talking about was how the rise of fascism and a sort of appreciation of the risk to humanity of technology, basically in the Second World War, led many philosophers and intellectuals generally to back off their rejection of religion as the way to think about the meaningfulness of human life, thinking, well, science isn't doing so well by us human beings as we'd hoped it would in the sort of optimistic first flush, the Enlightenment, and downstream from that, maybe we were hasty and should look to religion. And this was a way that Hook described Dewey's take on British absolute idealism and its American echo, above all in Josiah Royce, that idealism was seen as a way of pursuing a religious agenda in a post-Darwin age. And that recoil is what Hook described as the failure of nerve. The pragmatists saw themselves as reacting to that idealism no less than analytic philosophy did. There really were these two movements of recoil from idealism in Anglophone circles, pragmatism and analytic philosophy. And in the 30s and 40s, they're still contesting for who's going to take over the philosophy departments. Analytic philosophy won. They hadn't won when this essay is written. So the series of Failure of Nerve 1, Failure of Nerve 2 ran in the Partisan Review, this left-wing publication in the 1940s. Hook wrote in there, Dewey did, Ernst Nagel, another Dewey student, wrote in it. So that's a little sort of historical note, but Sellars is applauding pragmatism for sort of bucking up the empirically minded in the face of the failure of nerve, for sort of trying to give people back the nerve that they were losing, to be, in a broad sense, naturalistic again. But, he says, what you mustn't do is recoil all the way into psychologism, into thinking that philosophy is an empirical science. And he sees pragmatism as having aspects of both. On the one hand, it is tempted by psychologism, and on the other hand, it's marshaling resources to resist that. the way I would put this is, the pragmatists did appreciate the normative term. They did think about the task of philosophy in terms of articulating the norms in virtue of which we are the rational creatures we are. They sought to do that, starting with the kind of naturalistic norms that they could underwrite in terms of selectional stories of the sort that we find in evolution and that we find in learning. So a danger of sliding sort of too far into the naturalism, the factualism, the descriptivism. On the other hand, they are appreciating the norm. They're trying to underwrite norms for the use of symbols for assessing intelligent activity. So he sees them as trying to walk a fine line here, and that's in no small part how he sets up his attitude towards Dewey here. So he says, well, what's the important lesson? And as Sellars come from analytic philosophy, what do I want to say to the pragmatists to emphasize the good side and warn them away from the temptations of the dark side of psychologism? And so here, if you look at the passages, I want to explore from the standpoint of what might be called a philosophically oriented behavioristic psychology, the procedures by which we evaluate actions as right or wrong, arguments as valid or invalid, cognitive claims as well or ill-grounded, matters of justification. More specifically, our frame of reference will be the psychology of rule-regulated behavior. Now, it's the psychology in a de-psychologized sense. That's the line he's trying to walk here. I shall attempt to map a true via media, a middle way, between rationalistic a priorism, what he'll call rationalism in here, and what I shall call descriptivism, by which I understand the claim that all meaningful concepts and problems belonging to the empirical or descriptive sciences, belong to the empirical or descriptive sciences, including the sciences of human behavior. So he says, so that's the enemy. That's going to be psychologism, is descriptivism applied to the concepts that we use, that we apply to ourselves here. But now he immediately sees an issue. How can one assert the existence of concepts and problems which do not belong to empirical science without admitting the existence of a domain of non-empirical objects or qualities, together with a mental apparatus of acts or intuitions for cognizing them? Now, this view is what he's going to call rationalism, that besides the objects that natural science looks at, there are these other things. Now, exactly what are those other things? Well, rules are going to be among them. Abstract objects are going to be among them. And the relation between those is an issue. But the rationalist is the one who, as we'll see, Yeah, if you look toward the bottom of page 2 in the handout, second one up from the bottom, it's only by absorbing the insights of rationalism that a pragmatic empiricism can do justice to the facts. So there's something that the rationalists get right, and the empiricists need to keep in mind. Pragmatists as a version of the good empiricist. And he goes on to say what that is in this next passage, where the regulist, that's a term he's using to mean someone who appreciates the significance of rules. Rules in Latin is regula. And for those of you who are familiar with my corpus, he's using the term regulist here differently than I'm using it in making it explicit. Where I distinguish between regulism and regularism as attitudes towards norms, I pick up the word from him, but I use it in a different way than he's using it here. When we get to talk about some reflections on language games later in the session, I'll say how I'm using the term. But he's using it here just for someone who appreciates the significance of rules as explicit formulations of norms, and that it's a distinctive task of philosophy to articulate the significance of those rules. That's what he means by a regulist. And rationalists are regulists. The rationalists are the ones who appreciate the significance of rules, the way he's using the term here. Now, I want to claim in a bit that he's running a whole lot of things together under the heading of rationalist here, which in other places he's going to be careful to distinguish, but the polemic here, he wants the rationalism on the one hand and a pragmatist empiricism on the other hand, and he wants to show us a via media, he's saying, between the rationalism and descriptivism, and that via media is going to be a pragmatism and a pragmatist version of logical empiricism that he's trying to push here. So what is it about rationalism that a pragmatic empiricist needs? What's their insight? Where the regulist speaks of statements which exhibit the rules of the language in which they're formulated. The regulist who gets this right. The rationalist speaks of intuition or self-evidence. The regulist goes from the object language up to the metalinguistic rule. That's what Carnap's doing, that's what Sellars wants to do. Whereas the rationalist goes from the object language down to extralinguistic reality. The rationalist sees the norms in the world, sees that as part of the furniture of the world. And then we have the question, well, how do we know about these things? He says, well, there must be a distinctive capacity to grasp the normative dimensions of the world. The regulist explains the significance of the word must as it occurs in arguments in terms of the syntactical rules of the language in which it occurs. The rationalist explains it in terms of a non-linguistic grasp of a necessary connection between features of reality. And this is a picture he wants to take over from the rationalists, their non-reductive understanding of a normative dimension of things. But he wants to say they're making a mistake by seeing that as in the world, as seeing there being things in the world, norms, the fact that the inference from its being copper to its conducting electricity is a good inference, they see that as a fact about the world. Not a fact about the world that natural science studies. It can study copper, but not the goodness of that inference. But the goodness of that inference is something in the world that is not subject to study by natural science. And they're partly right, he thinks. When you say that's a good inference, you're not describing something that science might give you a different description of. But it's not because you're describing something else, something of a special spooky kind. It's because what you're doing is not describing. The rationalists are descriptivists. But they do appreciate the significance of norms. Well, now, how is this via media supposed to work? How can one assert the existence of concepts and problems, like the existence of a concept and a problem? How are we to understand the goodness of the inference from being copper to conducting electricity? He's using the shorthand of real connection. The rationalist sees a real connection in the world as underwriting that normative fact. We could say that that's a good inference, without admitting the existence of a domain of non-empirical objects or qualities, and then having to say, well, there's some non-perceptual, non-empirical way of finding out about these things, some kind of rational intuition. Now here you might think about Moore on non-natural normative properties. From Sellars' point of view, Moore's problem is that he's a descriptivist. Well, but then what are you going to say? He's responding to what Frank Jackson calls the location problem. If you want to talk normative talk, he says, fine, but tell me where in the world, as described by our best natural science, these norms are of which you speak. What are the truth makers in the scientist's world of these claims that you make, that this is a good inference? And Jackson's view, part of the Canberra plan project, is to say, if you can't answer that, you should admit, either, okay, I just haven't been able to give you that explanation yet, but if you think that in principle you're not going to be able to do that, then you should give up those concepts and admit there just are no such things, and you shouldn't be talking that way. That's like talking about witches. If you really think that you're not going to find in the world the scientist can describe, find out about by empirical methods, the witch-making properties of some human beings, then just admit that there aren't any witches. And similarly for norms. Now, Sellars goes on to say, this is the fourth quote here, notice that our suspicious pragmatist is the good guy at this point. He's giving credit to the Deweyan. He didn't say the concepts and problems of mathematics belong to naturalistic psychology. Didn't give a descriptivist, reductivist response. If he had, he would clearly be formulating a descriptivist philosophy of mathematics. And he's already said, so if you're going to talk about these abstract objects, say, aren't you going to have to be a million about mathematical discourse? And everybody thinks Mill is an idiot when he talks about mathematical discourse. But he didn't say that. He says they don't say that. They say there's no aspect of mathematical inquiry as a mode of human behavior, which requires a departure from the categories of naturalistic psychology for its interpretation. With this latter statement, I'm in full agreement, but it must by no means be confused with the former. So, these are as responses to that third passage. How can you assert that there are some concepts which don't belong to empirical science unless you admit that there's some things you can talk about, objects and properties, relations, that go beyond the reach of science? And so we're just saying, well, don't be a descriptivist. Realize there's other things you can be doing with the language than describing how things are in the world around you. There's no aspect of mathematical inquiries, using this as an example. The norms are what we're going to care about, but the abstract objects are in the same boat here, with respect to this issue. Location problem. Where are the numbers? Where's the number 3 and the number 17? When the physicist does her inventory of things in the universe, you don't find 17 there. Well, does that mean we should say, well, we do without it? There are no such things. Well, physics needs 17, things like that, to get on with it. Now, I should say, this has been contested. Physicalists like Hartree-Field say, well, if you can't solve the location problem for these things, then they don't exist for us good physicalists. And he wrote a book called Science Without Numbers to show how you could do mathematical physics without invoking abstract objects. He was immensely proud of this book, which it's a relatively slender book. It's mostly second-order logic and heavy measure theory. It's an extremely technical thing. He's using regions of space-time in place of abstract objects and showing how you can build everything out of that. It's a kind of Aufbau, but for the physical naturalist rather than for the empiricist. Sort of Aufbau on the side of ontology rather than epistemology. But he said he had always wanted to write a book that he would find on the carousels in airports. And he found his book, Science Without Numbers, there. He said he could only think that some buyer had looked at this and thought, oh, well, intellectually curious people, but who were turned off by mathematics, they'd like to know science, told without the numbers. Look at this thing, and it's all symbols that you don't recognize at all. But he said, but there it was. It was on the rack in the airport. So, Field is an example of somebody who took this location problem, grabbed it with both hands, and tried to solve it for the physicist. But what Sellars is putting in the mouth of the pragmatist, not as what they always say, because we'll see, because sometimes they fall over into psychologism, but the pragmatists have the right to say this, and sometimes they do say it. Look, we don't have to do our philosophy of mathematics the way Mill did badly what Hartree-Field did well. We don't have to do that because we're naturalists about the practice of using number language. We think that when you use these, you're not stating facts about the world. You're doing something else. Well, what? Well, we're going to give a broadly naturalistic account of practices of counting and show how kids can learn to count to use numerals, and then, having learned to count, can use them to learn to add and subtract and calculate. We're going to give a naturalistic account of the activity of using mathematical expressions. This is what Hugh Price calls subject naturalism. Just don't assume that the expressive job of all of your expressions, of all of your singular terms, is to pick out objects. Don't assume that the expressive job of all of your declarative sentences is to state facts. That's descriptivism or factualism. Hugh Price's term is representationalism. Don't assume that a representational semantics is the right way to understand the use of all these expressions. Now, I want to say Price goes too far in being a global anti-representationalist. He wants to say representational semantics isn't the right way to think about anything. Whereas I want to say with Sellars, no, there are some things, some discourses that where the singular terms really do purport to refer to objects, and the declarative sentences really are in the fact-stating line of work, but not everything is like that. But Sellars already in 1949 is saying, look, you've got to take the norms seriously, but don't think of there being these things, norms, that are in the world, in the way in which electrons and cats and carrots and alarm clocks are in the world. When you're saying what you ought to do, you're doing something different than describing how the world is. So let me... I'm not seeing this passage about what's in the world, but it's surely here.
There's a passage on the fourth page that where Hume charged the rationalists and for him common sense with projecting a subjective feeling of compulsion into the environment, and he charged the rationalists with projecting the rules of his language into the non-linguistic world.
Yeah,
is that the one?
That isn't the one I was after, but that's doing that. Yeah, okay, sorry, it's passage 7 on page 1 is the one I was after. As I see it, an inventory of the basic qualities and relations exemplified by this universe of ours, and in particular by the mental processes of human beings, would no more include obligatoriness than it would include either logical or physical connections. So, I mean, he is invoking this in seeing the in this passage about Hume and his rationalist about it. Yeah.
So given this understanding of the normative discourse, how would the Sellars of this stage, or someone who is, appreciative of the points he's making, respond to like a question about or request for the ground of the norms or something like that? That's what the rationalist is trying to do in a sense. Look, it's part of the world. That's why we're justified in engaging in this way. But then if you push that on the sort of Sellarian picture here, what would be the sort of response that a figure would give?
Okay. I mean, it's to begin to investigate what the relationship is between the normative vocabulary that says this is a good inference, and the modal vocabulary that says all A's are B's, or if something is copper, then necessarily it melts at 1084 degrees C. Here, passage 10 at the top of page 2, which he puts in a footnote. I shall be interpreting our judgments to the effect that A causally necessitates B as the expression of a rule governing our use of the terms A and B. So you might think that the worldly ground of the goodness of the inference from its being copper to its conducting electricity is a law that necessarily copper conducts electricity. And he thinks that's right, but he's going to understand that modal statement of the law as not descriptive of something in the world, but as a particular form of statement of a rule of reasoning. It's transposed, he says, and he's going to fuss a lot about that transposition. This is a kind of modal expressivism that's seeing modal vocabulary not as describing features of the world that ground our rules, and seeing then the rules of the language sort of hooking onto the world through observation reports, but the rules that get us around in it only justifying themselves by the way the whole thing hangs together and works. Now, he doesn't, at this point, have a very good story about this. He's feeling his way towards it. The best story he'll give us about the relation of the modal vocabulary to the rules of inferring in the language, the conformation rules is his term for this, is in the CDCM essay, Counterfactuals, Dispositions, and the Causal Modalities. And we're going to read that. That's in our period here. So, I mean, we get in him the opposition to descriptivism. He says in one of these quotes, "If I've become more and more happy of late about Kant's assimilation of the ethical ought to the logical and physical musts, it's because I have increasingly been led to assimilate the logical and physical musts to the ethical ought." For him, all of those are really about rules for making moves in the language, what in some reflections on language camps you call language moves. What he's talking about, this assimilation in Kant, is what people have often found puzzling, that Kant's use of the term necessary, notwendig, has two species, natural necessity and practical necessity. And natural necessity is the must of two physical bodies must attract one another with a force inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them and directly proportional to the product of the masses. So a statement of Newtonian law, that is a must expressing natural necessity in Kant's sense. And the must of the ethical, one must treat others as ends and never as means. He says that's necessity as well, that's practical necessity. Isn't he just running together two completely different things, confusedly under this heading of necessity, well, Kant's doing it on purpose anyway. He's saying there is, well, I should say, by necessary, notwendig, Kant just means according to a rule. He tells us that's what he means. And there's rules that nature obeys, and there's rules that people obey. And he says the difference is, of course there is a difference, but he's seeing this as a specific difference within the genus. The difference is that where natural objects obey rules, the laws of nature, are bound by rules in their behavior, people are bound by conceptions of rules. And the point is, the rules we're bound by depend on our attitudes towards those rules. This is his autonomy idea that a rule only becomes genuinely normatively binding on us if we acknowledge it as binding on us, if we bind ourselves by it, if we embrace it as a norm that we're subject to. But he says the rules, that there is a genus here. And he sees in Hume, and this was where the scales fell from his eyes in reading not even Hume's treatise or inquiry, but just a couple of excerpts from it that some completely dunderheaded German philosophers had extracted just to make fun of Hume. That was what Kant read, and he looked at this and looked right past the commentary on it, all surrounding it, and read these few passages from Hume and saw that Hume was focusing on a surplus over and above mere description of how things empirically are. On the one hand, in statements about how things must be, statements of necessary laws, and on the other hand, in the surplus of ought over is. That in each case, Hume was correctly seeing that there was some supra-descriptive surplus of content in these statements. And Kant's big idea in the vicinity was that surplus is absolutely essential to the content, to the concepts having the descriptive content they have. You're right, you can't reduce it to descriptive content, but this is part of the framework that makes description possible, and the idea that that framework is something about our use of the expressions, our application of concepts, not something about what the concepts were applied to. So this assimilation of those two musts goes very deep in Kant, and it's a measure of Sellars' evolution in his thinking about Kant. Remember, the first dissertation that he failed to write, the Oxford dissertation that he failed to write, rather than the Harvard one that he failed to write later on, the first one was a Kant dissertation, and there's various indications that at that point he was skeptical about this assimilation of the different kinds of musts under the notion of necessity. But he came to appreciate, as he thought more and more about rules, came to appreciate what was common to this. And I can't remember whether I mentioned this on one of my previous tellings of a Kant story, but this particular assimilation is what Grice agonized about the last decades of his life, and talked about in his Oxford Locke lectures, which he revised and revised for 20 years, and they were still unpublished on his death. But his student re-edited the manuscript and was published as Aspects of Reason. And it's sort of a mess, but one of the big ideas there is that it's no bit of linguistic accident that we use must and should in both of these senses, both in an alethic modal sense and in a deontic normative sense. Grice's idea was there is a mother conception that each of these is a daughter of, a specialization of. And if you want to understand them, you've got to understand their relation to each other and to that undifferentiated, primordial modal notion that hasn't yet divided into alethic and deontic modals. And though Grice was no Kantian, he had rediscovered a Kantian idea here, and has a lot of really interesting linguistic evidence. I mean, he was the avatar of the linguistic turn, and in many ways a paradigmatic analytic philosopher. And in this tantalizing, suggestive, sort of failed book, Aspects of Reason, he's pushing this. This line.
One of the things you just said, I'm just wondering about it. I mean, specifically in relation to the way you've sort of fleshed out some of these connections between these two notions of must. You talked about Grice as having this idea of there being like an undivided primordial notion and then it's splitting. And I was wondering if that's how one ought to think about this relation, if maybe, you know, there's two notions that are mutually or like only interdependently intelligible, but there isn't sort of like a thing prior to having both of them. That I don't know if there's any sort of real question that I'm asking this, but
well, I mean, Sellars in I guess Inference and Meaning says, I can't remember whether it's that or some reflections, says the language of modality is a transposed language of norms. And so this is one of the deep Sellarsian ideas that mostly people gave up on, I think, trying to understand. And Sellars himself didn't think he'd ever satisfactorily articulated it. I mean, I had views about sort of what that means in him and what was the view that was struggling to get out. And we don't have enough of his other stuff on board yet for me really to talk about that. When I talk about the punchline of some reflections on language games, I'll say, indicate one way one could think about it, which is almost certainly not Sellars' way. It's the way I think Hegel thinks about it. But now we're in explaining the obscure by the more obscure territory. But I'll see if I can give a crisp characterization of that view of it anyway, even though my candidate crisp characterization of the view Sellars was after will have to wait. As I say, we need more pieces on the table to get to that. we're seeing it in language, rules, and behavior. Sellars' conception of what the philosophical task is, that means what you've got to get clear about is what you're saying when you lay down a rule. What is the rulishness of rules? And how do we understand that in relation to what you're doing when you describe or explain empirical goings-on in the way that natural science is the master of? And this is a question that analytic philosophers didn't bother themselves with. Normativity in this general sense, not specifically ethical normativity, that they did, but this normativity that's pervasive in discursiveness and rationality, at least until the early 80s, in the wake of Kripke's Wittgenstein book on following a rule, which Kripke wrote as his senior thesis as an undergraduate at Harvard, just didn't publish it until later. But it was really only with the publication of that book that analytic philosophers, sort of as a mass, appreciated that normativity was the central topic of the philosophical investigations. The reception of Wittgenstein in the first 25 years, really, after the philosophical investigations, was largely a behaviorist, reductive, descriptivist reading of him. His student Norman Malcolm read him as a straight Skinnerian, Watsonian behaviorist, and that was a very influential reading of him that it took people a long time to pull themselves away from. Anscombe was never taken in by this, but people didn't understand what Anscombe was saying either. So it really took a long time for people to realize that this was a central topic for Wittgenstein at exactly the same period that the other human being in the world who is thinking about things this way is Sellars. And as I say, I think in many ways, Sellars, because he's trying to give an account of this in a way that Wittgenstein wasn't, it gives us a very important perspective on this, and in many ways, I think, is clearer about it. Okay, already here, he says, and this is right, passage 11, we must distinguish between an action which merely conforms to a rule and an action which occurs because of the rule. A rule isn't functioning as a rule unless it is in some sense internal to action. Otherwise, it's a mere generalization. Now this, if you looked at the opening of some reflections on language games, this is what sets the problematic of that essay. We've got merely conforming to the rule, merely being regular according to the rule, in the way in which the behavior of physical objects is regular, codified in the laws of nature. And then there's rule-governed behavior. Rule where it's because of the rule that the regularity obtains. Now we have a very I'm not seeing it here, but it is in here that he says, knowing that this is, right. In passage 15, a rule, so look at 14, the mode of existence of a rule is as a generalization written in flesh and blood, or nerve and sinew, rather than in pen and ink. A rule finds its expression either in what are classified as non-declarative grammatical forms, so that could be a command, for instance, or else in declarative sentences with certain special terms, such as correct, proper, right, ought, and so on, the ones that mark the normative significance of it, the normative modal expressions, which serve to distinguish them from generalizations. What do these special features in the formulation of rules indicate? They give expression to the fact that a rule is an embodied generalization which, to speak loosely but suggestively, tends to make itself true. See, rules, Kant talks about binding yourself by a rule. If the rule lives in you, if you endorse it, he's saying, then you act according to it, or tend to act according to it. And he's putting this in this loose, but I agree, suggestive way that you understand the force of these distinctively normative expressions. Ought. If you understand expressions of the rule as tending to make the generalization that they codify true, appreciating the normative force, something having that normative force for you is for it, we would say today, I think, for it to give you a reason to act in a way that would be assessed as correct according to it. For you to grasp that normative force, for it to be normative for you, is for it to provide reasons for you to act as it enjoins you to act. Sellars doesn't, at this point, put this way, but you can think of rule governedness as having two dimensions. One, the rule serves as a normative standard for assessment of correctness of performances as either correct or incorrect, according to the standard supplied by the rule. And furthermore, it does that in a special way. It says what you need to do to be correct. If the rule is orders and decorations will be worn at the embassy reception, that's setting a normative standard for acting correctly according to that rule. Wear your orders and decorations. And it's setting that standard by saying what you must do, describing it. That's distinct in principle from providing the standard for it. So, for instance, in the opening Sprachspiel of the investigations, the slab language game, the builder says slab or pillar, and depending on which noise he makes, the assistant is to bring him either a slab or a pillar, whatever kind it is that's correlated with that call. Wittgenstein's term is ruf, call. He doesn't call these orders. What it is a vocal but not a verbal game. That is, it's a matter of noises, but not yet of words. Calls where it's appropriate to respond to this call by bringing a call of this kind, by bringing a stone of this kind, and appropriate to respond to a call of this other kind by bringing a stone of this other kind. There's norms involved. It's correct or incorrect to bring this one thing. If he brings the wrong thing, he responded incorrectly to the call. But Wittgenstein wants us to see that sort of proto-normativity. He's going to say that genuine normativity. I mean, normativity isn't one of Wittgenstein's words. It's a phenomenon he's caring about. He says, look, there's nothing mysterious about how you could, beat the poor assistant into submission so that he brings the appropriate thing, responds appropriately to the calls as the one who taught him determined what was correct and incorrect. There's nothing spooky or hard to understand about how that could be, about how the call could make it appropriate to do one kind of thing rather than another kind of thing. I think Wittgenstein's careful not to think of those as imperatives, as orders. Because orders are like that. An order or a request, shut the door, is appropriately responded to by doing one kind of thing and not another, just as the hoof is there. But in addition, when I request you to shut the door, I'm telling you what to do. I'm specifying what's correct by describing it. And that, the noises, pillar and slab, are not in the game. You can tell they're not because you can only give real orders or requests, shut the door, in a language in which you can say the door is shut or the door is not shut. The capacity to give that order is parasitic on the capacity to describe the situation. And we don't have that yet in the primitive calls of the slab and pillar game. And that's important to Wittgenstein because he doesn't want to presuppose that you've got the whole language up and running as part of the background for this, and you don't, for the stage setting for it, and you don't need it. You can understand how a noise, the low-pitched noise, you bring one of these, the high-pitched noise, you bring one of these other things. So this first dimension of rulishness, rule-governedness, is establishing a standard for assessments of correctness or incorrectness of performances. And doing that, if it's a rule, it is not just a mark of the norm, it's an articulation of it, an expression of it. It determines what's correct or incorrect to do by saying what it is. It's the explicit expression of a norm. And third, for rule governedness, what's actually done has to be subjunctively sensitive to what the rule is. In the sense that if the rule were different, you would do different things. If somebody's performances are really rule governed, it's not just that you can sort them into correct or incorrect by the rule, it's that sorting actually makes a difference to what they're doing. They're sensitive to it. And that's an alethic modal issue, not a deontic normative one. But rule governedness involves that aspect too. And I think Sellars is gesturing at this in talking about darkly, but suggestively, as he says, about a rule as something that tends to make itself true. the normative vocabulary that goes in the explicit statement of the rule, the ought, the proper, and so on, is something that if you are properly brought up and understand it, it's having that normative force for you. Is the rule tending to make the generalization true? I mean, this is colorful because we're sort of just the medium whereby rules instantiate themselves on this picture. And this is something that the Czech philosopher Jarda Peregrin, in his book about rules and inferences, takes very seriously. That we're not just creatures who live and move and have our being in a normatively structured space of rules, but are something like the tools of the rules. We're the necessary incarnations of the rules, the means whereby the rules come correctly to specify what happens matter-of-factually. Now, this is sort of worrying about this. What he realizes he's just able to gesture at with this notion of a rule is an embodied generalization that tends to make itself true, is this notion of expressions of rules playing two roles. One as something that we're subjunctively sensitive to, a lethic modal role in the causal order, and two, being a normative standard, setting a standard of success or failure, determining what's correct or incorrect by explicitly saying what it is. And let me just, in this connection, point you back at that passage 10, the first part of it that I didn't read then. I should be inclined to say that the use Jones will make of instances of a rule here is rather of the nature of Socratic method. For Socratic method serves the purpose of making explicit the rules we have adopted for thought and action. So Sellars is, in this half of a sentence, looking back at Socratic elenchus, the method of Socrates, and saying, look, you have all these implicit norms that are governing your use of terms like pious and loved by the gods. And what I'm doing, I, Socrates, am doing, is helping you to make those explicit, to formulate them in terms that say what the norm is, so that you can give and ask for reasons for them and see whether, once you've made it explicit, whether you really want to endorse that rule, and whether it's compatible with the explicitation of some other norm that you've realized you're committed to, and that this is the very form of self-consciousness about sort of what you mean by pious or loved by the gods, because it is those norms governing the use of them that articulates the content of those concepts, Sellars is saying. So he gives us sort of his take on what's the big deal about Socrates. Well, he's doing philosophy, and philosophy has this explicative task, the care and feeding of the expressive tools we use to turn norms into rules, which we can then confront with each other and reason about. Okay, let me point out some other things about this essay. Under the heading of rationalism, I've already mentioned that he thinks of the rationalist as taking not only rules as being descriptions of items in the world, norms, expressions of norms in the object language, which he's going to say properly should be understood as metalinguistic. So metalinguistically we can say, if you're committed to its being copper, then you're committed to its conducting electricity. That's a statement in a pragmatic metalanguage. Pragmatic because it's talking about your attitudes of being committed to. And that's going to, and it's using normative vocabulary like committed. Or if you claim that it's copper, then you ought to admit that it conducts electricity. And he thinks that statements like it's a law or it follows from laws that laws of nature, that anything that's copper necessarily conducts electricity. He thinks that's a disguised metalinguistic statement. That's the way you put that claim in the object language. Carnap, in the logical syntax of language, had described these things as quasi-syntactic expressions. Syntactic expressions, at that point, was his way of talking about meta-languages. And he said these are quasi-metalinguistic expressions. What they're saying is something that belongs in a meta-language explicitly, but it's put in a misleading object language form. And as we've seen from a couple of the passages, and some of the ones that I haven't read out at the same note, Sellars thinks the proper way to understand that is to ascend to the meta-language, where the philosopher works, where rules are made explicit. But what the rationalist, who appreciates that there are these connections, the kind of connections that reductive empiricists like Hume didn't, the oughts and the musts of the two kinds that empiricists can't find an epistemology for, because the only kind of knowledge they admit is empirical knowledge. That's why you can't get either the natural necessity or the practical necessity, the ought or the necessary, from empiricism. So the rationalists are right, as opposed to the empiricists, saying, no, these are crucial bits of our conceptual armamentarium. But the rationalist treats them as though they're object language descriptions of things in the world. Treats statements of natural laws, Newton's law, F equals ma, as though it were stating a kind of super fact. And so that's dead wrong. And no more are you stating a funny kind of fact, a normative fact, when you say you ought not treat other rational beings as means to an end, but ought always to treat them as ends in themselves. You're also not stating a kind of super fact, a normative fact. And crucially, Carnap had said, when you say redness is a property, it looks as though you're referring to something, redness, as though in addition to there being in the world red things, there were this other kind of thing, properties, which we now have to ask questions like, well, how are properties related to the particulars that characterize them? How is redness related to the red particular, to the thing that is red. And Carnap says, when you say redness is a property, that's quasi-syntactic. That's saying something that really belongs in the meta-language, would be made properly explicit in the meta-language, as though you're putting it in the object language. And then you think, the object language, its business is to describe the world, so this term, the singular term, redness, must refer to some kind of thing. Now, is it different from its tropes, its unrepeatable instances? How are these related? Whereas Carnap says the proper expression of what you're saying when you say red is a property is red is a one-place predicate. That's what you're saying. You're talking about the expression is red in a metalinguistic way. So Sellars says, the trouble with the empiricists, they're descriptivists, they don't see the crucial role that's played by normative vocabulary and modal vocabulary and abstract object talk of abstracta. The empiricists say, how would we ever know this empirically? How could we come to describe the world in these ways? From our point of view, this is mysterious. And the rationalists, at least, see that these are absolutely crucial, that we couldn't mean what our ordinary empirical descriptive terms mean without what's expressed by these other kinds of terms. But they're descriptivists too, and think, okay, there's just more in heaven and hell, more in the world than you empiricists are dreaming of here. And it's true, you can't know about them empirically, so you must know about them non-empirically. Besides empirical facts, there's normative facts, there's modal facts, there's facts about abstract objects, logical facts, all of those. And they're wrong. The proper view that he sees Carnap as opening up is to see these as disguised metalinguistic expressions. That's why the new way of words, that's why descriptivism is the enemy. That's the common mistake, the mistake that's common to the empiricists and the rationalists. That's the way in which he sees Kant as having moved beyond the empiricism and rationalism that he inherited. It's actually, from this Sellarsian point of view, sort of ham-handed to think that the way in which Kant overarched and synthesized his empiricist and rationalist predecessors is that the empiricists assimilated everything to sensuous intuitions and thought of concepts as something they had to be able to build out of intuitions, and the rationalists thought of sensuous intuitions as confused concepts, assimilated everything to concepts, and Kant had to come along and say, no, these are really two different kinds of things. It's not that that wasn't going on, but that's not deeply the way in which he moves beyond empiricism and rationalism. It's moving beyond the common descriptivism that they have. And Sellars is trying to make all this explicit using Carnap's talk about rules and this idea that a way to think about the respectable use of concepts that is not a descriptive use is to think of it as being in a meta-language, as being a metalinguistic use. And he says, with this insight, this new form of Kantianism that the new way of words gives us, that's analytic philosophy. Analytic philosophy is neo-Kantianism in coming to birth in the middle years of the 20th century. Who else thought about analytic philosophy this way besides Sellars in the next 40 years? No one. that this was his idiosyncratic vision of what analytic philosophy could become. In fact, it stayed resolutely descriptivist. It did not learn this lesson about abstract objects, about modality, about normativity. And if, and insofar as Sellars is important, it's because there is something to this idea that a way to take Kant's insights and bring them forward is to bring them forward in the form of a philosophy of language, a way of talking about discursive practices. That's the unfulfilled potential of analytic philosophy. That's the route not taken, the one that he's pointing to here in 1949 and in 51 in some reflections on language game. It's a vision of what analytic philosophy could be, could have been. It's probably too late now for it to be analytic philosophy that does this. It did something else. And if one carries forward this Sellarsian program, well, we can make gestures at carrying forward analytic philosophy, but that isn't what it's going to look like to the true believers in that program. But okay, I talked about McDowell's taking me to task for wanting to transplant perfectly healthy pragmatist organs into the rotting corpse of analytic philosophy. I think there's a nice symmetry to wanting to do that, as Sellars, sort of at the dawn of it, is saying what it could become, and you say, oh well, there's still, we can still keep some of it going this way. Okay.